Dylan was that guy, the one who had it all figured out when it came to having fun. Life was just one big game, and he was the master player. Every day was an adventure, filled with spontaneous road trips, late-night parties, and mornings spent sleeping until noon. He had a job, sure, but it was just enough to cover his rent, beers, and weekend escapades. Dylan never worried about the future because, in his mind, the future was too far away to care about. He lived in the same apartment he'd had since college, a small but cozy place cluttered with memories. Posters from concerts, a guitar he never really learned to play, and a fridge stocked with nothing but takeout leftovers. His friends loved coming over because Dylan's place was the spot to hang out, where responsibility seemed to disappear the moment you walked through the door. But time has a funny way of catching up with you, even when you're running as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Dylan turned 35 without much fanfare. His friends threw him a surprise party, of course, but when the night ended and the last person staggered out the door, he was left alone with his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he didn't like the quiet. The emptiness of his apartment felt heavier than usual. He brushed it off, told himself he was just tired, maybe a little hungover, but the feeling didn't go away. Days turned into weeks, and that nagging sensation only grew stronger. He started noticing things he hadn't before, like how most of his friends were settling down, getting married, starting families. They still came around, but not as often. They had lives, responsibilities, plans for the future. And here he was, still living the same life he had 10 years ago. One night, after another round of beers on the couch by himself, Dylan found himself scrolling through social media. He stumbled on a post from his old college buddy, Mark. Mark had just been promoted, moved into a new house, and was expecting his second child. Dylan stared at the pictures, Mark smiling with his wife, his kid running through the backyard, and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but more of a realization. A question started forming in his mind, one he'd been avoiding for years. What have I really done with my life? He tried to shake it off, telling himself that Mark was just on a different path, that there was no right way to live. But that night, for the first time in years, he couldn't sleep. The climax hit him out of nowhere, like a punch to the gut. It was a Tuesday, just an ordinary day. He was at work, staring at his computer screen, pretending to be busy, when his boss called him into the office. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, but Dylan could tell something was off. Then, his boss laid it out. They were restructuring, cutting costs, and Dylan's position was being eliminated. It didn't hit him at first. He nodded, mumbled something about understanding, and walked out of the office in a daze. It wasn't until he was back at his desk, staring at the cardboard box they'd given him to pack his things, that reality slapped him in the face. He didn't have savings, not really. He hadn't bothered with a 401k or any sort of retirement plan because, well, that was for people who worried about the future. His rent was due in a week, and he had no idea how he was going to pay it. His friends? Most of them were too busy with their own lives to notice he was spiraling. For the first time in his life, Dylan was scared. Not the kind of scared you feel when you're about to do something stupid, but the deep, bone-chilling fear of realizing you've wasted years of your life, and there's no way to get them back. The days that followed were a blur. He applied for jobs, but nothing stuck. He didn't have the skills employers were looking for because he'd never bothered to learn them. He'd been too busy living in the moment, and now the moment was gone. He tried to reach out to friends, but their responses were lukewarm. They had families, careers, real problems. Dylan was just the guy who used to be fun to hang out with, but now he was a reminder of what they could have been if they hadn't grown up. One evening, he found himself sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the walls that had once felt so comforting. The silence was deafening. He thought about all the times he'd laughed off responsibility, all the opportunities he'd let slip by because he didn't want to be tied down. And for what? So he could be the guy everyone wanted to party with? Tears started to well up, but he pushed them down, telling himself he was too old to cry. But the more he tried to hold it in, the more it hurt. Eventually, he couldn't stop them. The tears came in waves, years of regret pouring out of him as he sat there, realizing that he had no one to blame but himself. The next day, Dylan got up, showered, and decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He looked in the mirror and asked himself what he really wanted. Not what would make him happy for a moment, but what would give his life meaning. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living like he had. He had to start over, from scratch. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally waking up. Dylan knew he'd wasted too much time, but he also knew it wasn't too late. The regret would never fully go away, but he could live with it as long as he did something about it. And as he stepped out of his apartment, for the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was.